What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to the Abundant Journey podcast. We've been doing this for over 50 episodes, so it's time to change up my intro. As always, though, I'm your host, Nick James, with Nick Offenkamp. Nick, what's going on, man?
Hey, these are my favorite episodes because, one, we're in person, which always just has a better vibe to it.
Oh, yeah.
And two, because we're with someone that we know, love, and admire. And so, again, I never like stealing your thunder. I will let you introduce our guest as much as I want to right now. But why don't you share with our listeners who we have the privilege of sitting down with today?
Well, I will run at this. We're going to go for it. Toby Lucich is hanging out with us here today. And I think I might know Toby a little longer than you. The irony of it, though, is that my wife was originally nanny for his kids when they were younger. So we're kind of dating all of us here.
Boy, that does tell a story, doesn't it? Yep.
But the beauty of sitting down here and keeping the friendship alive, keeping the entrepreneurial spirit alive, is that you've been an entrepreneur for decades. And it wasn't until I really dove into what entrepreneurism is that basically I said, hey, here's somebody in my corner, in my backyard, who's been doing this for years. So we need to sit down and have a good conversation.
Well, and even with where you were going with your story, so your wife started as Toby nanny, and then when she, I don't know if it was because she was engaged to you or whatever,
probably.
She then there was the opportunity. She introduced my wife to you and Toby, and then my wife started nannying, and I was thinking about that the other day as in preparation for getting together with you. Yeah. I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know if he knew it or not, but you were kind of the first one to inspire entrepreneurship in my family, because my wife beat me to it. She was self-employed and starting her nannying business. So, thanks for getting that entrepreneurial ball rolling early in the Offenkamp household. But
it's excellent.
I'd love to just kind of start out with, what does a day in the life or a week in the life look like for you now? I know we've said high level entrepreneurship, but really, how would you describe to listeners or somebody who approached you off the street of just what do you do? Yeah,
great question. I think everybody imagines what we see on social media, right? And it's true, the models on your arms and from Sundance to Cannes Festival, it's exhausting.
Beach and Mai Tais.
But when I take a break,
yes, when you come back from Burning Man,
it is. It's as you guys know, as you're building your own book of business. Entrepreneurship, I think we've put on a little bit of a false pedestal, and by that I just mean we have all these Story.com successes, and they're oftentimes presented as one person's defining vision, and then you look at somebody like Elon Musk, who has just thrown energy behind somebody else's vision and stepped into the forefront. And so when I think about entrepreneurship in the simplest of terms, it's somebody that just isn't quite comfortable with the way that things normally work.
Yeah.
And so they bristle a little bit under all those rules. They generally have a different view of how things should play out, or maybe they love the work that they're doing, but they see other ways to optimize either their time or the autonomy that they exercise, or ultimately, so oftentimes it's strictly the cash.
Sure.
Totally. And time and cash are two sides of the same coin, right?
Yep.
So I have Will said, my now 20-something, right, said, when he was in his teens, he said, Dad, it seems really strange to me that we have time and we have energy and we have money. And he said, right now, as a teen in high school, I don't have any time or money, but I have all this energy. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, that sounds about right.
Yeah.
Now you want me to go away to college where I have less time and I'm going negative economically, and I still have all this energy. But by the time I get to the other side of it, and I've paid off my debts and I've run my life, I have retirement, we have time, I have cash, but I don't have the energy anymore to take advantage of it.
Yeah.
And so that's stuck with me a lot. And so when I think about entrepreneurship, it's a nice way to move outside of that standardized triangle.
Sure.
And that's kind of how corporate America is defined, right? Is there's this balancing act, and that's what we need in a business. We need people's time and energy, and then we need some kind of financing. So being able to combine those on your own terms, I think, is a great definition.
I love that.
It's a really astute observation of your son.
Yeah,
That's an
I would like
amazing
to take
thing for him
credit
to
for
be able
that.
to put together so early on.
It might have been when my wife was nannying. She instilled those principles into him.
He had a lot of terrific influences. Yeah, he's been holding on to credit for that. But yeah, it could have been any of these incredible women that he's been fortunate enough to know.
I love that working definition, though, of kind of the spirit behind entrepreneurship and trying to bring perhaps better balance to those three things of how you're expending your time, energy, and cash, and not having so much of a lopsided, those three things. They often can feel like in the standard model of doing things that, you are always heavy on one and lacking in the others. And then it was interesting, too. You just talked about how, I can't remember exactly how you said it, but entrepreneurship, often just looking at things and just being like, that could be done better, or just not totally content with the way that something is, which I think most of us probably view the world and see areas where it's like, that could be improved, or this is missing. But there's so few who will actually then go out and take the risk and do something about it, right?
It's true. Yeah, I think you call out something, and it's this idea of risk tolerance. And so anybody that has set up an online account, like a brokerage account, or sat down with somebody that wants to talk about financial planning, risk tolerance is always this conversation, but we don't talk about risk as part of our day-to-day personal lives so much.
Sure.
Don't jump off the roof, you'll break your leg. We get that. But, where do you put your time, and what is the consequence? And so when it comes to entrepreneurs, I think there are those that just inherently come to it. As some of your past guests have shared, I too was one of those kids with a candy hustle. And
it's such a theme, man.
It totally
the theme of success.
But I had so much success, I did a repeat. So I'll tell you about that a little later.
Yeah.
But what was interesting to me was that I grew up the son of entrepreneurs, and the grandson of entrepreneurs. And generationally, we're both at the single best time to launch our own venture, but also the highest level of saturation we've ever seen.
Yeah.
Right? We're inundated with offers and opportunities from people all over the globe. We were talking earlier just before we started, about digital products and the power of leverage. Yeah. And so with all of this information going on, how we position and how we present, and then how we use our network is so much more important. But when my granddad, first started having a mechanic shop, that was his skill and trade.
Yeah.
He was a genius with his hands. But when he opened up a little mechanic shop, it was a very practical reality. I've got to figure out, how do I put food on the table, not how do I self-actualize and build an empire, right? And so I think that for a number of folks, there was always been a traditional path. And for me, coming of age meant going to college, and then following college, my dad said, God, be sure that you negotiate benefits. He didn't have those running his own small real estate office.
Sure.
And so for him, that was a huge part of getting a college education and then a job that's commensurate with that education.
Yeah.
Today, that's just stock and trade, right?
Absolutely.
But to him, that was part of the golden handcuffs. And I think every generation sees it differently. And so this idea of risk is on a continuum. I early on, I tried to step out. I wanted to be my own business owner. I wanted to run my own show, but I didn't know what I was going to offer.
How early do you think that hit? I mean, you mentioned the selling candy, but was it like, at 6 years old, you were like, I'm never working for the man, I'm going to start my own thing? Or where was that like first epiphany of that, I want to be a business owner, I want to do my own thing?
Probably in the womb was when it, no, I think, I don't know that it's ever so clearly formed. And
Sure.
It's certainly not for me, right? I was always envious of those friends that are like, I'm going to grow up and be an architect, or I'm going to be I had no idea. I knew that I wanted to have some money, and I also needed time to use the money, right? And I needed energy to get good value out of both of those things. But as a kid, there wasn't a lot of extra cash. My folks had 5 kids, and real estate in the 80s could be rocky because interest rates make today look awfully attractive.
Like a Candyland.
Totally. And so there were certainly some lean times. And for me, entrepreneurship was just, how can I take a creative approach to getting what I want? So if I want to buy comic books, and a century ago, when I was at that stage, they were about 60 cents a piece. And so one of those first things was we realized we could make these Caro syrup suckers, right?
Okay.
Pour them into molds and then hawk them at school for $0.25 a sucker. I felt like a gazillionaire with a big old wad of quarters in my pocket until I got caught. And then I discovered that there's the rules, and then there's the not published rules, which is, no engaging in commerce with questionable and unclear kitchen practices backing your product. But it did it provided a taste of it. When you could start to see what goes in versus what you derive out the back end, when that equation starts to shift.
Sure.
Right. And you're able to put less in and get more out. Mm-hmm. Most of us get excited about that.
Yeah,
no doubt.
You've really hit on something twice now that I don't think I've heard any of our guests talk about. They've lived, but this entrepreneurism out of necessity. And it's kind of interesting because you talked about how grandpa, it was necessary to put food on the table. You talked even the comic book story, it was, I wasn't getting any other money. Out of necessity, I got to find a way to make that work. And so that's an interesting piece because I think a lot of times as we go back to what you really first started with, there's so many people that have this romantic view of what being an entrepreneur looks like. And people are just going to line up in droves because you have an incredible offer or because you're the next greatest thing. But so many of the stories I think we've heard on this podcast really people are born out of that necessity, and that's what really drives them forward.
Yeah, I think what necessity provides us, if we're weighing that against a general risk tolerance, right? So somebody may be risk adverse, but if they're unemployed and they have people relying on them, right? Or if circumstances have shifted dramatically, the hustler comes out.
Yeah.
And we get scrappy and we get inventive. Yeah. And I think that necessity can show up in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. I'm a Gen Xer. And so the path did not discuss trade school. Right. All things being equal, I probably would have done a trade for the first 3 to 5 years because the barrier to entry was learning the skill. Mm-hmm. Once you've done that, you become the boss. Like that's how you maximize those trades. It's not always being the guy with the screwdriver in your hand. It's figuring out how do I put more guys with screwdrivers in motion. And so I think that that's a great call out. And some of the most successful entrepreneurs that I've had the opportunity to work with have maintained that sense of hunger because it's a curiosity plus hungry, right? You can be curious about the world, right? And stay in your head and research and explore. And it's fascinating. But you got to be a little bit hungry to take that next step and do some of the uncomfortable things. Yep. Which is documentation. That's a killer, right? Yeah. So, for all the work that you guys do during the interviews, there's also all the post-production. And then there's the posting and promotion. Nobody talks about that. Yeah, They're just like, I love the podcast. And every venture has these elements that aren't sexy. And so they're like, oh, you're the CEO. And it's like, yeah, and I dump the waste baskets. That's what being an entrepreneur often looks like, right? Yeah. So I love that you guys have had folks across the spectrum because it really is true. It's born of so many different things. But that itch is ultimately the driver, I think, that's a common element.
Yeah.
I think it's helpful to put the finger on that. I mean, it's funny because I think about my oldest son, who's really into both Pokemon and football cards right now. Yep. And he keeps asking me like, hey, Dad, can I have money to buy more cards? And it's like, well, bud, like you could pick up the dog poo in the backyard for, a couple of bucks because it's just not, I'll do it myself. Or you can figure out another way to make money. You could sell something. You could sell candy,
Right.
or whatever it is. And it's been cool to see, like, he's running into that issue of there's something in the world that I want. And so, am I risk tolerance? Am I comfortable with just the guarantee that I can do this job that I hate for my dad for a couple of bucks?
Yeah.
Or, am I going to go to the trouble of actually coming up with something that I can sell and maybe have a much higher reward, or maybe it doesn't work out. But so that's been an interesting piece to see. And I suppose even in my own life, like, we could talk about the shift in real estate, and
Right.
we're working for a builder, sales fell off a cliff. And so it was like, all right, I got to go out and do it on my own, because like the example that you used, like there's kids and wife around the table and got to put food there.
But I love that you call out that even early on, we have the opportunity to nurture that entrepreneurial spirit. And just for a quick second, oftentimes when we think about entrepreneurship, we're thinking about going off and creating your own business and your own brand. We don't talk as much about intrapreneurship, which is taking a creative approach inside of an existing business. And I think some of the most powerful entrepreneurs, we don't think of them that way, but that's exactly what they did, right? They just brought a different perspective to it.
Do you have some examples of that come to mind? Like, entrepreneurship is not a concept that we've really talked about much, so I'm really glad you bring it up. Yeah. That's fascinating.
A great example of that, I think, is like Jack Welch, right? He didn't start GE, but he radically redefined the culture and defined, and from an application perspective, it's not just he had a concept of what management looks like, but he was applying that concept rigorously. Right? We credit Jeff Bezos with starting Amazon, but what we don't always pay attention to is the entrepreneurship and some of the evolution that took place inside of that business that wasn't exclusively him.
Right.
Right? There's faceless folks that what they're really doing is they're looking at a process and they're saying it breaks down. And so what's the next iteration of it?
Yeah.
And so I think anybody that we're working with that starts to do this, and you guys are both in the world of doing deals. Not everybody is, but I think that that's an exciting place to be, because you have the opportunity each time to say, are we going to structure this per usual? Or what other levers do we have? What variables can we play with? And I think entrepreneurs can be wildly successful. It's a question of what is it that they want out of it. And so the worst case is you're fantastic. And I have several friends, a guy that I'm working with in the startup, and he said, I keep working myself out of jobs because I'll automate all the tasks. And there's a perfect example. Like, organizations are asking him to leave. Don't keep cleaning up our mess, because he's been laid off twice because he removed a job through automation.
Wow.
Why wouldn't you celebrate that guy?
Yeah.
Totally.
If you just saved us $1 million a year, what's the downside to a $200,000 bonus and know that he will never go anywhere?
Yeah.
Right. But businesses don't think like that.
No.
So I think that's why entrepreneurship oftentimes is viewed as this thing that happens outside versus inside. But most of the biggest companies, have so many of these people that we can't name, off the top of our heads, just because they're not celebrated the same way.
Well, and it just reminds me, of the contrarian. When we recently had another episode with Kylan, and he had talked about, that contrarian perspective and that point of view of, and the necessity of having those people at the table, because a lot of times, the main leader, the entrepreneur, the inspirer, the person who's the voice, they have one way and they say, we're going to go this way. But I think a great entrepreneur is going to surround themselves with those contrarians who attack the different angles, and not even from a negative perspective, but just a creative perspective, and say, well, is there a better way, or can we do it different, or should we do it different? Which is what Kylan was talking to us about.
Right. And with the entrepreneurship idea, I think I love that you bring that up, because there's many folks that I've talked to, and probably some of our listeners as well, where they feel like, okay, I've been working this W-2 job for a decade now, and like I've kind of, when it came to the risk assessment, like I made my bed. Now I got to lie in it. I wasn't brave enough to go out and chase the dream. But I think that entrepreneurship mindset of that, like, hey, what can you build within your organization? Where do you see opportunities for greater efficiency or building on a competitive advantage or whatever it is in your given W-2 position? And even if that doesn't result in an equity position in the business, or it kind of pans out the way that it did for your buddy of like that you provided millions of dollars in value and then got shown the door.
Right.
The fact of the matter is that like you still have proven to yourself that you can build something of real value that didn't exist prior to your efforts, which I think does then get at the heart of, what an entrepreneur does.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of a hopeful thing for people within, that have
Absolutely
a desire for more.
I think the difficulty with entrepreneurship is that organizations by design, what we've come up with in the West, the structure is very much about shareholders that drive benefits and then employees that should be grateful to have a job. Mm-hmm. That's this public tenor, right? That's kind of the quality of it right now, especially in a down market.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Folks with strong tech backgrounds and product management backgrounds 18 months ago were batting away offers just to be able to walk down the street. Today, they can't even get a phone call back. Yeah. And so what's interesting, though, is when you've been in a position long enough, we start to see other things, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like, well, I'm always out of here by 5, and that's attractive. Mm-hmm. I have so many weeks of vacation, and boy, that's sure nice. The cost of letting go of what we have only increases over time.
Right.
And so it requires a little bit of extra. You got to be a little hungrier. Mm. And it doesn't have to be economically. It can be, how do I get benefit from the improvements I make? Mm-hmm. And so corporate America today, I think, tends to say, thank you for introducing the benefits. Our shareholders appreciate that, but we'll see you back in here tomorrow morning at 8. I'd probably still be in the corporate world if the improvements and efficiencies I introduced, if I shared in those benefits.
Right.
Because a bigger stage means more dramatic changes.
Yeah.
But when you step out on your own, nobody knows what you're doing.
Yeah.
Even though you try to explain it sometimes. Sometimes you don't even know what you're really doing is the heart of it, right?
So true.
And so, but you have a small stage. So you could have the absolute best mousetrap in the world. But now it's also on you to make sure that everybody else discovers it. They're not going to magically find you.
Mm-hmm. Well, and talking about that, we've had a lot of conversations around sales, and I know it's a passion of yours. It's where you get to engage, meet new people, and just the hunt and the chase. So I think that's a great transition point. Tell us some of your skills within sales that have had to develop and grow over the years. Maybe some things that you've learned as you've been in different sales roles. And I think you are absolutely of that belief. Hey, you're always selling. Whether you're in a sales role or not, you're selling. So let's dive in there a little bit.
I love that. Yeah. Some of it begins with the simple notion of, do you have a strong opinion? Right? And I don't care what that opinion's about. But if you have an opinion that you'd like to see others adopt, that's selling.
Yeah.
Right? If you have a perspective or if you've seen an easier way, then just letting other people know. And so I had a cousin that swore he would never go into sales. Guess what? He's in sales. He sells insurance and has done incredibly well for himself. But the thing that made a difference for him was he said, when I took off the hat of I'm trying to pimp another used car that nobody wants, and instead it became I'm an expert at something, and people know me as that expert, and I'm a resource to them. He said, as soon as I thought about it as education, all the barriers went away.
That's cool.
Right? And I think that the best salespeople, they're not looking at it as, can I get you in this car today?
Yeah.
Right.
And give you ludicrous financing. Instead, what they're asking is, what is the question behind this person's question?
Yeah.
So whether it's insurance or, my consulting world is predominantly around organizational change. So organizations want to be static. They want to do the same thing every day because it's predictable.
Yeah.
And that's how you turn a business into a machine, right? So everybody has these fantasies that will show up as a cog. We'll do exactly what we did yesterday, smack the hammer, and then away it goes. But the reality is that we're not. It takes a lot of discipline. And so when I go out to talk about change, my first job is always trying to gauge how much a client might understand about that. Because there's an inherent assumption of it's self-evident, right? When you show a house, you could say, isn't it beautiful? It's clearly a brand new house. Mm-hmm. But then you still go through and you're pointing out things. We've got a certain fixture here. We have high-end finishes here. And calling attention to those things is an educational process.
Yeah.
And so when I think about sales, the two things that occur to me is, one, it's just like interviewing for jobs. Put your best foot forward and try to provide some value as soon as you can. And that's just being aware of what you know and what you don't know.
Sure.
Right. But of course, too, you have to be offering those things in a place that people are looking for them. So you may be the world's foremost expert on organizational change management, but a one-person company doesn't need that. That person's already going crazy and they're in the midst of all the changes. So when I talk about bigger platforms, there's certain skills that play better in bigger arenas.
And it's hard to say what's the more challenging thing to do, right? Like is the more challenging thing to develop the valuable skill, or is the more challenging thing actually to market it? You have been successful in your career because it seems like, whether you would say it this way or not, you've kind of cracked the code on how to do both the sales and marketing, and continue to grow the platform that you've had to reach different clients and companies. I mean, you've had some huge clients. We haven't gotten too much into your career path, but I know that when I first met you, you were consulting with Nike and doing change management with them. So you've been working with global brands on huge projects. But I imagine that wasn't your first job, your first consulting gig. And so I am curious, just what have been some of the lessons that you've learned, how you go about cultivating a skill or developing a product or an offering, and then figuring out, okay, how do I get a bigger platform to share this with people?
Yeah. I think that so often we feel the skill deficit first. We may have a big idea, right? I want to launch this new product, so I'm going to throw up a website. And then you go, oh, now I got to figure out how to throw up a website. Yeah. And before that, you're like, well, now I got to find images that mean anything. So all of a sudden, in pursuit of your idea, the things that hit you first are the skills that you're missing.
Yeah.
And if it's selling or marketing, those show up too.
Yeah.
And so I think folks that iterate fastest tend to succeed. And by that, I mean they have an idea, they get it out there, they try it, they get feedback, and then they make those refinements. And so I came out of, I went to school, my undergrad degree was in finance, and I thought I was going to be an investment advisor. That's really what I wanted to do. And I'd worked in mortgage. I saw what the bank tellers do, and Nick, a thing or two about that.
A little bit.
Nick James. Yep. And so, there's very traditional paths, but the skill piece. And so I was into my late 20s before all of a sudden I went, oh, I have a pretty unique skill when it comes to running numbers and starting to put estimated values on activities. It's one thing to pencil things out, like in the mortgage business, there's a sale price, how much down, how much, for the loan. Mm-hmm. But when you're talking about making big investments, like let's transform a business or let's expand our locations, you don't have readily available numbers always to look at and say, well, gosh, this is going to give us a 45% rate of return. Yeah. And so developing that skill for estimating is enormously valuable, right? Mm-hmm. So anytime you're launching into a new venture or new structured approach, you've got to figure out whether it's going to behoove you. So it's an interesting question, that idea of skills versus marketing. I came to marketing a little bit later because I found that the skills themselves weren't always self-apparent. They weren't obvious. And so, think about like a favorite song on the radio. What we don't appreciate is how long it took them to grind through the lyrics. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And how many different scores they put the lyrics against before they found a hook. So it's all that pre-work. And I think as we take cycles at it, as we run at it, we start to find little cheats. And so we can find faster ways to iterate. And I think probably a number of your guests would say, yeah, I figured out 1,000 ways not to do it.
Sure.
And then I got the one way to do it. And now I carve a month out a year or whatever. So all of us have those little tricks.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that's so good. And it's interesting because we talk a lot about skills, but I think we don't as often talk about, hey, what are the skills you don't have? And, a lot of times it's the education piece that we get from our guests that say, hey, I had to learn. We had an attorney who said, I'm going to go to law school to learn the skills that I need to do real estate well. And so the necessity of learning and that continuing education always continues to come up. What's that look like for you? Because I know you've been a big proponent of education and you've always been a student of what you're doing. So how has that looked in your journey?
Yeah, great question. I think part of it is our interests change over time. Mm-hmm. And so I have a master's degree. I went back and got certifications in areas that I was focusing on, largely because it's not that the certifications isn't how I acquired the information. It's how I evidenced that I had acquired the information.
Sure. Right.
We have to learn it before we pass the test, but the test is that's the gate that everybody's watching.
Yep.
And so so many of the skills that I've had to pick up later were things that I didn't value. Mm. And so that traditional, Harvard Business Review trajectory would say, you start your career, you go super deep in very technical skills, establish yourself, this is traditional corporate world, establish yourself as a reliable, cog in the wheel that can manufacture, can create those things. But then you have to flip over to developing all these soft skills when you shift into management, right? Positional power, now you have influence power. And so I think that those soft skills, I had a hard time placing value on them because I was so focused on building technical skills, right? Doing calculations and doing assessments and time and motion study. And all of a sudden I went, oh, there's a world of facilitation and there's an art to effective conversations, right? There's an art to getting your point across. And entrepreneurs are not. My favorite people are continuing to go, oh, that's interesting. And then you'll see it bubble up in conversation later. So when they talk about you being a reflection of the 5 people that are closest to you,
sure,
right? That's why it's so important to have curious, hungry, growth-minded collaborators around you, right? They're going to help pull you along instead of you trying to drag and tug everybody else that doesn't see it or just isn't wired like that.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I think about like using Nick's example of Joette, who it was very apparent to her, like she needed both the skill and the degree, the certification that came from going to law school. But the soft skills are something that are much harder to learn in any sort of like formal educational environment. And so I am curious, both as you look back on your own career development, as well as you think about counsel to somebody who is kind of in the early stages of their career, but do aspire to leading people. Was it mentors or masterminds, or what kind of things would you commend for cultivating those soft skills?
This always happens, right? We always have some favorite mentors. Mm-hmm. Some of them were horrible, horrible managers, and I'm not going to call them out by name.
Sure.
If I could remember their names, I would. But so oftentimes, my own experience was that didn't feel good. I'm going to make a point not to do that to others.
Totally.
Sure.
Right? Or, wow, that felt like a vote of faith. How do I apply that? Mm-hmm. And one of the executives I worked for in my early 30s, we were in energy. It was a big utility across several states, and I was leading out on the initiative for our entire functional team, which drove the revenue for the utility. And he said, here's the thing. If you hit a blocker or a barrier you can't get around, let me know as soon as you can. Because he said, if what you do is continue to try to fight it and push through it by yourself, you look like a duck on the pond. And from where I sit, it looks like it's smooth sailing. So the best case is it looks like it was all smooth sailing. And then if it blows up in the end and I only hear about it then, I'm going to ask, Toby, what were you doing? It was all smooth sailing. But he said, if you tell me early on that you're kicking really hard and you're paddling with everything and you're not making headway, that's when I can intervene. He said, I can't do anything about it when the dust is settled and the history's written. And I thought about that and I thought, that idea of transparency is invaluable, because I would have never thought to go to the senior executive and say, hey, this guy's not playing ball with me. That sounds like whining, right?
Sure.
But instead, when he posited it as, I'm here to remove the barriers and tell me early and often, what a great open door.
Yeah. Right.
And so as a manager, as a collaborator, sometimes it's simply asking, what gives you concern with this task? Or are there things that don't make sense? Why don't we get started a little bit and then bring back some of those questions? So I've never been actively involved in a formal mastermind, but I feel like I have the good fortune to have a lot of masterminds, in my personal network. But so many friends sing the praises of these designed communities, because people are all coming there looking for something very similar. So I think it's a really nice model, but good and bad. There's a lot of examples all around us, and they're not always work related.
Yeah.
So many of the things that we learn, the behaviors we learn at work, apply at church, or they apply with our kids. I think so much of my learning as a manager is the byproduct of being a parent.
Sure.
You guys are deep enough in this now to go, oh man.
Yep.
What's worked with my kids at home and what hasn't.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Well, and I think there's something to that. We're all Hermosi fans to some degree.
Yeah.
And so I think there's something to where he's just learned half this stuff just takes time. It's just, and you're speaking to that, I think. It's going through it and learning it, and sometimes bashing your heads against the wall, sometimes having people come and tell you to go around the wall. I mean, whatever it is, it's just progressing and not giving up and continuing. So...
yeah, there's that, call it tenacity or grit. There's so much research that's come out in just the last 10 to 20 years on this. And it really is that idea of you just have to get up one more time, then you get knocked down. That's success. And you think, boy, that sure sounds easy, right? If only I'll just keep getting back up.
Yeah.
But it does take time. And I think it's hard to discern the results that were effort-based early on versus results that were lucky. And too often, I think we want to take the lucky results and claim them because we've been working hard, but that's just correlation. It's not causation. And I think that's maybe at the heart of what entrepreneurs do really well, is they can discern what also happened while I was working and then what happened because I was working. That's the signal to noise ratio, I think, that we're always trying to find. If I take an action, do I see a result?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's an incredibly valuable exercise, probably for any and all of us to go through, but especially as you're leading a business and trying to think through the return on the different actions that you're taking and what actually is attributable to things that you've done versus just the sort of dumb luck. Nick bringing up Hermosi kind of raises another interesting question for me that I'd love for you to speak to, both from, again, your own experience, but also all of the entrepreneurs and people that you've been around. Is right now, there's so much to do with hustle culture, and you see that, all over social media and whatnot. And so it's easy to get caught up in the mindset of that, you got to grind. And if you're not succeeding, it's because you're not grinding hard enough. And my concern in some of that is that while it sounds really good, you apply the same thing to like a high school kid playing basketball, and it's like, well, the reason you're not LeBron James is because you're just not grinding hard enough. It's like, well, maybe at the end of the day, you're not LeBron James because you're not 6'8" and
right.
You're
5'2" and you only have a 2-inch vertical. But aside from that, you could be the next LeBron. Yeah,
So
you're right.
I'm curious just how you found a sustainable pace in entrepreneurship, and what kind of advice you would have that might either serve as a balance to some of that hustle culture, or like when you're grinding and if it's not working, at what point, what are the markers of, well, you just got to grind it out for another year and success is on the other side of that, versus you should probably pivot and go a different direction. Any thoughts on any of that?
Knowing when to sell or knowing when to call it is incredibly difficult. And so you talked earlier about having some contrarians in your world. Having people that challenge you. How will you know if it's worth continuing? That's a tough question, right?
Totally. Whether
it's chasing a deal or, I bought stock because I thought it was going to take place, something exciting was going to happen. When do you sell? And so it's a super hard one. This is why I think that idea of curious and hungry are so essential, because if you're curious and hungry and it's not happening fast enough, you're going to pivot.
Yeah.
Right. The times where I feel like I'm just grinding it through are frustrating and depressing, and I tend to internalize it. It's not like the market is bad. It's nobody likes me. I'll just go home and eat worms, and so I think oftentimes folks that are diligent about making a diary approach, whether it's I'm going to do so many calls or I have 3 big stones to move this week, having something to focus on helps break that perception of I'm failing.
Sure.
Right.
Just having some objectivity so that you're not just subjectively floating around in your head and comparing to everybody else that's succeeding. Or
That's right. Yeah. And when you're starting something on your own, which so many folks do, right? The side hustle thing. We call it hustle, but it's not. It's like a series of part-time jobs. So when Uber came out and all the ride shares, and it's like, here's a side hustle, or Airbnb, rent out, 3 square feet of your living room. They were presented as hustles, but it was really like monetize the resources you have. You have time in a car. You have 3 feet of square feet of unused floor space, right? And there's trade-off because you're giving up something. Time, energy, and resources. You're giving up the resource, but often you're giving up your time. And I think until we know what our time is worth and the things that we're choosing not to do, whether it's time with kids, downtime, our physical health, there's a lot of trade-offs along the way, and we're not always keenly aware of them.
Sure.
And so as I entered school, I pivoted halfway through my undergrad, and I felt like I was behind. I don't know what the measure was, but I felt like now I'm late to the dance. Which meant I just need to go year round to get out in 5 years. And I did, with no big aplomb, but I survived it and got the degree and moved on. But I felt like I had to get down to a serious adult job. Right. I don't know what my rush was, but I felt like I was behind. And I think there's a keeping up with the Joneses quality, that I think we're all cognizant of. But that's how we start to brick ourselves into a corner. And all of a sudden you sit there and go, well, I've built an entire life that's completely predicated on whatever my income is. And I can't step away from that because everything will crumble. And so probably one of those best elements around giving yourself room to run a little bit further is just simply living within your means.
Yeah.
So again, my 20-year-old, he's like, hey, I got a job. I'm not going to school right now. I'm just doing adventures. I think I'm going to move out with my guys. $1,000 doesn't go very far. If you don't have any bills, $1,000 is a lot of free cash, right? But when all of a sudden you're like, oh, yeah, TV and utilities and internet, all those things, there goes my money.
Yeah.
And so there's perspective taking, and it changes over time. But staying within your means, that's in so many regards, right? So if I'm 5'2" with a 2-inch vertical, I'm not going to play man-on-man with LeBron.
Yeah.
But I will find a weight class that I can punch at. I will find a place where I can be competitive.
Yeah.
And that's a little bit of the trick too. Yeah. So big fish in a small pond, that's great. You might get to call the shots, but are you really flourishing?
Yeah.
And so oftentimes it's a matter of just kind of sticking your head up and looking around to see what other ponds are out there. Mm-hmm. So,
well, and I think in that goes back to your advice of mentors and people who are around you, and the necessity, because it's so easy to hear the wisdom of just put your nose down and grind, and then all of a sudden you look up and you've been grinding in the wrong spot, or realistically you've been playing a game that you don't have any business of playing, and that's okay. That's part of the failure and learning process. I think about one of our friends that we had, I think, coffee with one afternoon, and he just was like, "Hey, what's your next step forward? Is it, something you're close enough related to and your skills are close enough related to that it makes sense to go there and just continue to inch forward? Or is it just completely out of nowhere? It's like if I were to go try to create code for computers, which I don't even know if I'm saying it right, let alone I don't even know how to do it. So, again, it's like, am I trying to jump into something that I just have no business of being in?
Yeah. But you touch on something that's really interesting, and it's that there's both, can I enter that marketplace, but also if I do, what do I bring that's of value? And so for a time I was doing a lot of what looked like more traditional financial audit, but it was all process focused. And among the folks that did that, I took hits for not being a CPA and not coming up through the big five. What could you know about process and compliance? But when I started talking about how do you change a culture to value those kinds of behaviors, they had nothing to contribute. Mm-hmm. All their experience was stuck in one area. And so I think regardless of whether you choose a career working for somebody and optimizing your lifestyle in terms of what that exchange looks like, or whether you're launching on your own, I think we all need to find 2 or 3 bases of competence that we can lean on. Because anytime we walk into a room and everybody has an identical skill set, we don't stand out.
Yeah.
Right? Nobody says at a realtor convention, I need to track down Nick because he's a realtor. Mm-hmm. Instead, it's I need to track down Nick because he's doing any interesting things with social, or he's structuring conversations and talking about things in a different way. And I think that that's something that when we have 2 or 3 pieces that we uniquely blend, mm-hmm. That's where our unique skills really start to shine.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that takes an extra level of awareness, right? Of just what makes you tick and uniquely you, and to a degree, then it also requires being comfortable with standing out from the crowd, which I think a lot of people have a hard time with, right? It's easier to go along on the proven path with, like you could have done with getting in with one of the big 5 CPA firms, and it's a well-trodden path, and you would have been respected as any of the other ones, but they would have been most likely at that point hiring you because of your affiliations rather than because of you uniquely being you and providing what only you can provide, which I know has been so much at the heart of even what we're doing with Abundant Journey, is just trying to encourage folks to take hold of, that thing that makes you unique, the unique value that you offer to the world. And while that sounds so like kitschy and
sure,
I feel like I've seen that on a cat poster somewhere. There is a real reward in operating as yourself, and maybe you can speak to that some, like just the fulfillment that you have found in kind of paving your own way as an encouragement to others who are wondering, like, man, if I really go after what sets me apart, I'm going to stick out for a while. Is it worth it?
Is it worth it? That the piece that I find fascinating is that whether you're sticking out or not, we may not be able to say, when I grow up, I want to be whatever. but we know what we enjoy. And so I grew up the eldest of 5 kids. So like it or not, I was kind of born into the boss role. My siblings might disagree, but it was clear to me that was my job.
That's right.
But that idea of helping to advance a preference, I felt responsible for that early on. And I grew up in scouting and youth group and sports. And I always felt like, there was an obligation to make sure that our collective perspective was being heard. And so for me, it was both, am I serving as an effective repeater of our collective interest? That was one of those gifts that I wouldn't have said when I grow up, I want to repeat what everybody else thinks is important. But also, how do you fashion that, and how do you get that message heard? And so for me, one of the most rewarding activities is engaging in things that look more educational and sharing information. In large part because if you've ever had to repair something, I'm not a mechanical guy. I wanted to be an inventor. I asked my granddad to show me how to do all this stuff, and he's like, you don't want to do this. Go to college. As he's looking at his gnarled knuckles after 60 years, he's like, yeah, go have the easy job with the air conditioning. But while I wasn't a physical mechanical inventor, what I loved was that, everything comes down to some kind of information asymmetry. Somebody that has all the knowledge and expertise, their life is easy. But if they don't share it, everybody else's life is still difficult. And so whether it's doing formal training or just doing informal training, and I think the work that you guys are doing is very much a form of training, right? You're sitting down with folks and working really hard to extract the nuggets in hopes that somebody will hear a strategy or a philosophy or a perspective that resonates with them.
Right.
And so for me, I came into it a little bit later, and I discovered that as I started doing more training, you don't always appreciate how much you've come to learn until somebody asks you questions and you go, gosh, I wasn't making up any of those answers. Those were all legit. Look at me, right? Yeah. Those moments where you're like, oh, good on me. Yeah. That sounded very adult of me and competent, and so.
I love those moments. Yeah.
But I think that's a little bit of the work. And so there's the world of organizational change. What I really love is that it's so heavy in the world of like behavioral psychology. Why do we do what we do? And there's this theory called the Dunning-Kruger effect, where I may know nothing about motorcycles, which would be absolutely true, but if I spend a weekend with somebody that's a motorcycle aficionado and they teach me enough to ride, I might feel really expert relative to where I'm at today. I'm not an expert relative to everybody else. There are all those people that have ridden motorcycles, that have built motorcycles, or have lived that lifestyle for decades, right? And so Dunning-Kruger is you grab that first piece of knowledge and you start to speak and behave as if you were the author. Right? And we've met those folks.
Oh, for sure.
You have to push through that. And it's painful when all of a sudden you realize how little you actually know about your given domain or areas of interest. It's a little bit alarming, right? So we talk about real estate as a form of investment, and I am, for so many reasons, I'm a big fan of that. And it takes a whole series of expert bodies of knowledge to be able to acquire, to be able to tune up and then maintain a property.
Yeah.
And it varies, So I may know a little about electrical. Does that mean I should be doing it? Probably not.
Probably not.
Is it enough to change a light fixture? Sure. And knowing where you're at, I think there's a measure of humility that's got to get interjected there.
Yeah.
So
it is interesting, like how some of that though is attested, like your skill and where that information asymmetry is in your life. I think an indicator of that is, what are people coming to you asking for help with? Which I think you'd kind of touched on, but just think if listeners are asking, well, how do I even identify where I have unique value to bring? That information asymmetry is a big thing. What comes easy to you that doesn't seem to come so easily to everyone else? Yeah. And
I think about your son who's resistant to picking up poop.
Yeah.
which speaks to how hungry he is for his next Pokemon or football
That's
card.
right.
I'm not a big sports guy. I find it entertaining, but I would be equally entertained with a fishing pole. I'm neutral, right? I'm ambivalent. But I'm willing to bet that your son, the football card fanatic, can probably talk a blue streak about these things.
Oh, yeah.
And I love these young people that get so fired up. And it can just be that they're playing NBA jams on the console.
Yeah.
But they can tell me about the unique gifts of the characters, the players.
Yeah.
They can tell me about what the scores are. You know, we all have to find that thing. And I think oftentimes we discount our interests because it's difficult to abstract, right? So some people are very drawn to factual, knowable things, right? Am I memorizing and can I recite? And others are drawn towards trends. You know, for me, it's mental models. So it's more trends behavior. I look for what's common as opposed to what's unique across clients and organizations. Because what it does is it lets me identify a best practice that's not industry specific. And then I can start to compare every problem against that. But pattern matching, I wouldn't have said when I grew up I want to do pattern matching. And that's going to be one of my key skills.
Sure.
You know, or truly listening, deep listening, I think is a skill.
Oh, yeah.
Not the, sure, mom, I'll pick it up and whatever. You know, there's deep listening. And it takes a different kind of investment. The elimination of distractions and being fully present. And it's exhausting.
Sure. Yeah.
So
totally different level. Well, and so within that, I've been excited to ask you this question simply because you have a unique vantage, not only with all of the different things you've tried, the investments you've done, but with the vast array of people you've worked with. So we talked about it a little bit before, but what is the secret sauce to success? And I want you to attack it from a couple angles. One, I want you to really kind of reflect back on your story and say, hey, like what's been some essential things? And I think we've hit just in conversation there, but I want you to call it out. And then I think too, I want you to really dive in and share, as you've worked with all of these companies, like what's the difference between the ones who really grow and get it and they just are on a rocket ship and the others that flounder or struggle. So I'm putting a big task on you there.
yeah. So I guess ketchup is not the secret ingredient that I get away with on this. The humility piece is a double-edged sword, and knowing how and when to swing it makes a world of difference. And so let me back up a little bit. I said being curious is invaluable. Being hungry is invaluable from an entrepreneurial journey, I think. But knowing what you don't know is really hard at every stage of life. Because again, Dunning-Kruger, I can go research something for 5 minutes ago. Great, I understand the whole world of Bitcoin. We all know it's more than a 5-minute research task, right? But in 5 minutes, I can have a sense of it. And so if we approach the world, and I think that, you know, to your specific question about what is it, when I recognized my own lack of information and realized that somebody else is super steeped in it, I went from trying to figure out how do I do it to how do I engage them? If not to do the task, then to give me their cheat codes. So if you've ever had to hire some professional tradesperson, you know, plumbers are my favorite. You've been wrestling with a plug toilet for days and they show up 5 minutes later, they hand you a $200 invoice and everything works. That's because they knew the one thing to do, right? And that's where experts shine. And so when you can shift from how do I grind through to figure out how to perform the task, to think about who knows how to do this, it unlocks a whole different world. And so that idea of surrounding yourself with very effective collaborators and getting comfortable being uncomfortable. You know, it's not fun always to walk in and say, hi, I'm Toby and I have absolutely no idea how this thing works, but that's why I'm here. Everybody's really welcoming when you show up like that. And I've shown up to plenty of trainings or conferences and just kind of said, I'm here and I have no concept of what you people do, but I'm fascinated by it. Because everybody has something to teach us.
Yeah.
And I moved around today. People don't think anything of being at a job for 3 or 4 months and time to roll on. They haven't promoted me to VP, time for a new job, right? This is the story that we Gen Xers love to repeat, and I think every generation has been the same way. But when I was moving about every 2.5 years for about the first decade of my career, and what I found was that every time I entered a new venue, and I was shifting industries too, so neither of those things were smart, during that era. But from a purely learning perspective, every time I'd come in, anyone else in that company knew more about the company and the culture and how it operated than I did. So as I shifted into consulting, what dawned on me was every single person inside of this organization is a resource that can either point me in the right direction as to who I need to speak with or help lay out the process. How do I take that very next step? It may not solve everything, but it moves you just a little bit further down the road. So if there's a secret sauce, I think it's being comfortably ignorant and then doing it with a bit of humility and kindness, so that folks are willing to step in and help you understand it differently.
I think that framing is really important. It's easy to let our insecurities drive us. And so to feel like, oh man, I'm walking into a room where everybody knows more than I do, and they're viewing me with the skepticism of what do I have to offer. But I love how you talk about that of when you walk into those situations, you're looking at everybody around you and the knowledge that they possess and these are people that are resources. And if you have that mindset of that, hey, we're on the same team and I'm here to help work us towards a common goal. These people aren't threats or enemies, but actually these are really valuable assets to get us where we need to move forward and go. I love that reframing of.
Well, and you guys have probably experienced this too. I mean, how many folks have you reached out to and they said, I'm very smart, but I don't want to share. I don't like to talk about myself or share my opinions about the world. Yeah. There's so many people sitting on a treasure trove of insights, or they're gatekeeping a lot of information, but they don't see it that way.
Yeah.
And so just inviting them to share is wildly powerful, as all your listeners would attest to. I mean, I've listened to several episodes and think, oh my God, I need that guy's contact information. I need them to hook me up with that woman that was on that episode. Yeah. She's a brilliant strategist that way. So, there's things that we have to uniquely come to understand, right? Mm-hmm. And that's in pursuit to realizing who we want to become. But I don't have enough lifetimes to be able to do all these things or develop the mastery across all these realms. So finding very talented people that just have invested or gotten to a place where it feels supernatural for them. Mm-hmm. Those are the folks that I love to curate, right? Mm-hmm. I'm going to keep track of all these things. And so while I don't always remember names, I'm good with faces, and I'm weirdly good about random details. So I may not see somebody for 5 years, but I'll remember their kid's name.
Yeah.
I don't know their name, but I remember their kid's name, or I remember that they used to live in Montana, or, it's those little details, and it gives us a sense of connection. And I think we're all looking for that. Mm-hmm. All the money aside and the big vacations and, being celebrated at Sundance.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely.
There's so many things in life. We just keep chipping away at it quietly and in a back room. And everybody's like, you're an overnight success. Well, yeah. Right. 10 short years to overnight success.
And then one night, boom.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. No, I know. And that's what's, it is funny. Like we talked about Hermosi earlier, but you listen to him talk about like the first 4 or 5 years of recording podcasts and creating content and having just, first a few hundred and then a few thousand listeners. And he was kind of plateaued there for years and years. And then, it did seem like an overnight thing.
Truly.
Actually, it's the Grammys that always kill me because they always have like the best new artist award. And there have been so many times where it's like, man, I've been listening to that artist for 4 years, but they just finally are getting I don't know what the Grammy criteria for new artist is, but to your point of just like, it takes years to often cultivate that success. And then of course, once it happens, people want to call it overnight, but
just overnight. I'd be curious because both of you guys, the world would say your jobs are sales.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. Is there a habit that you focus on that helps you get sharp, stay sharp, continue to sharpen? Have you guys landed individually on singular habits that?
I think for me, it's a lot of the stuff that you've already said. I think it's the humility. I think it's the consistency. I think it's recognizing that there are much smarter people in the room than you. And so just that it's that, and I learned this early at US Bank when I was doing small business banking. One of my first sales managers was like, having that curious mind and that hunger, those two together, like you say, it shoots you above your peers and your colleagues just because you are willing to do the work and you're willing to ask the questions. And so I
love that.
I would say that that's probably a pretty significant piece for me just in my journey, even in banking. What about you?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's certainly a big piece. Humility is always kind of funny because it's like, as soon as you start to talk about it, it feels like it disappears. So that is a piece, but
it's like a shadow. You try to grab it.
Exactly. But the other one that I feel is like almost this irrational trust or expectation that it is all somehow going to go well. And like I don't fully know how, as far as like how business is going to pan out or how doing the work of continuing to cultivate relationships, doing the essential tasks that I know that I need to do, but then just having this firm belief that that the trajectory of life and that the trajectory of the world is for all of its brokenness and issues, a generally positive one. Somehow I think that keeps me moving forward in growing my business. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how much to put into just like putting off a different vibe or energy or kind of attracting the, whether it's the clientele or success that you, whether it's people talk like manifestation has been big in vogue, and there's a lot of different ways I think that whether it's spirituality or different traditions kind of phrase that, but there's something too like just what you expect or hope for tomorrow kind of has a way of coming true. Rarely exactly how you imagine it. But but it is kind of like
right?
if you have an expectation and hope of success or growing something, and you just believe, even when it doesn't seem rational to believe that it's going to happen one way or another, generally seems to. I don't know.
I love that though.
It's
because
spooky, but what do you think?
I would definitely rather be stranded on a boat with pragmatic optimists. And by that, I just mean they're optimistic because they realize there's work to be done and they're going to do it. Mm-hmm. And that blend of, as you were saying, there's a consistency. I'm going to show up. I'm going to do the work. Strange how the harder I work, the luckier I get.
Right.
And the luckier I get, the more optimistic I become.
Yeah.
And so it's a Herculean feat to think that you can shift, huge sea change events or restructure the way that the world spins by yourself. But as you start to develop relationships and find like-minded people or people that choose the same future, or optimistic in the same way, it's amazing what happens.
Yeah.
Right. There's a Martha Graham quote that my mother-in-law shared with me years ago. But fundamentally, it was this idea of once you commit yourself to something, the universe is prepared to marshal all of its resources and surround you with who you need at the right time.
Yeah.
It's the indecisiveness that kills.
Yeah.
Don't I know that? I've been caught in that many a times.
Yeah. No, I mean, it reminds me of a Mark Andreessen quote, probably one of his most popular. And of course, I'm going to butcher it now, but it has to do with the world being an infinitely malleable place. And that it is remarkable the number of times where you set your feet in a particular direction with a vision and a goal, and how the world will kind of morph to allow that to happen. And just where a lot of folks flounder, and where, from time to time myself, honestly, will flounder, is just having that clarity of vision of this is what I'm going after. But
it's true. The Dirty Jobs, Rowe.
Yeah, Mike Rowe.
I was watching an interview with him, and he was saying nobody sets out to be a porta potty cleaning guy. Mm-hmm. Somebody discovers that it's work that needs to get done, and they get in there and they do it, and all of a sudden they have a fleet of these units and a whole host of folks working for them, and they're not elbow deep every day. And I think there's a willingness that some people have to do the things that others don't.
Yeah.
Right? It's willing to do the job that others won't or don't. Mm-hmm. And so oftentimes we all want to do what everybody else is doing. Mm-hmm. And so your kids are probably doing the same thing that my youngest did. Once upon a time, she's like, well, but Dad, I'm just going to be a TikTok star. I'm like, oh, okay. How are you going to do that? Well, on TikTok. I mean, at the time it was right. YouTube, right?
Yeah.
MySpace. No.
That was my...
right? Yeah.
Yeah,
ours was like yearbooks. Stay cool, have a fun summer. with pen and paper.
That's right.
But it is interesting. It's one thing to say, I want to be a billionaire, or I want to be a movie star, or I want to be famous, but we don't know what those things entail. Mm-hmm. And that's the naive approach. And so then how do we get closer to understanding what that means? The closer we get to truly appreciating what celebrity looks like, I think most of us go, you know what, I'm going to take a pass. Mm-hmm. I enjoy the anonymity I have. It's not worth, so many dragon coins. But unless you're curious enough to explore it, how do you ever unpack that?
Right.
Well, and maybe in that, another question I've had for you, because you've been, again, around asking, learning, being around some of these awesome business owners, what's some expert advice you've heard from before that's really completely bogus? Like, hey, yeah, I've heard this and have found out this is furthest from the truth.
Yeah. The age-old advice is like, well, just buy low and sell high. Strangely, it is not obvious when it's either low or when it's high, right? And so that's a piece of advice that it's not that it's wrong, it's that it's incomplete. Mm-hmm. What I wanted was, how do I know what low looks like? Is today a good time to be buying homes or selling homes? I couldn't tell you. Mm-hmm. But in a true market-making fashion, there's not a market unless you have a buyer and a seller that'll do a deal, right? Whether it's loans or houses or consulting engagements, software, it doesn't matter. And so figuring out how to determine what low is and what high is an art form. Mm-hmm. And I do think that it is highly subjective, and it tends to be very industry and situationally specific.
Yeah.
Right. What was a good price on a house 5 years ago is not it's not an option on the market.
Right.
Right. We may look back 20 years from now and think, oh my gosh, remember how cheap it was back in the early 20s? It's all relative, and time plays a big role in it.
Yeah.
So the buy low and sell high was incomplete. The other one of just stick with it, just get it, just grind in there, right?
Yep.
The get in there and grind it is also incomplete, because it suggests that more of the same is going to produce a different result. Mm-hmm. And so I think for me personally, the hardest part about corporate America was you have to serve a certain amount of time. There's a seasoning that takes place without regards to the quality of your work product. And so entrepreneurship, or being in something that has a more direct line of sight from my effort to my reward.
Yeah.
Those there's a certain personality that's drawn to those things. So yeah, it's funny. I think oftentimes, to your point about best, worst advice, right? we don't realize it at the time.
Yeah.
It sounds if it's exceptional, we usually don't appreciate it, the nuances. And that's been my own experience. Only after I try to follow it and then don't apply it effectively and then dismiss it, then I come back later and go, oh, this is what they were trying to communicate to me, And so what I love about the interviews that you guys are doing is that I can then listen to those episodes later and go, right, yeah, there it is. Yeah. So if I don't understand it the first time, it just means I need to listen to it again. Yeah. So
that's awesome. Yeah, and I suppose that's the nature of all advice is that it's fundamentally proverbial, right? And so they're general truths. But on the buy low, sell high in particular, when it comes to real estate,
what's the secret?
There's never a bad time to buy or sell real estate. It's always the right time.
That's right. If you're working with a tartan team, there's never a bad time.
That's right. Absolutely. You're always selling high and buying low with the tartan team. So shameless plug right there.
That's right.
Nick, if you got to charge me ad revenue for this episode, you know where to find me.
That's right.
One of the singular best pieces of advice actually comes from a movie called Layer Cake with Daniel Craig. It was one of the first movies I saw him in. And anyway, it's a situation of a drug dealer trying to get out of the business, and nobody wants him out, right? There's been a series of these movies, but the big powerhouse guy says the art to business is being a good broker. And I think so oftentimes it's not that you have to have the money to loan to businesses, but it's being in a position to bring those parties together. Yeah. And the same as in real estate. You don't have to own all the properties that you're offering. It's just that you're creating a space for people to find what they're looking for. Yeah. And I think, entrepreneurs do a really beautiful job of finding a space that they find fascinating and entertaining. And then everybody just looks at it and says, gosh, you're in the middle of all the deal flow. When we talk casually about stuff, I'm always curious to hear about what are your conversations, your day-to-day conversations. What kind of interesting permutations are turning up? What atypical deals are coming up or problems that require more inventive solutions? That's what I get excited about is the ideas. Yeah. But ultimately, being a good broker, being a good connector, I think is in the world of good advice.
Yeah.
That's probably one of those best pieces was your job is to give more than you receive and be a good connector.
Yeah.
I don't have to have all the answers. I know smart guys like you. So, if nothing else, I get a tough question, I pass it off on one of my colleagues and let them wrestle with it, Right. But you invest a lot of time getting to know those people that you can trust are going to do right by those referrals.
Yep. So. Well, that's been such a rewarding piece to this podcast is connecting listener to guest as well as guest to guest and seeing that like-mindedness. And I think that really speaks to the abundance piece of, we're better together. We're here to serve one another, like you said, and we recognize that there's so many other people around who can get things done far beyond what we're capable of doing. And so that abundance piece just continues to come back.
I love that. Yeah, the growth mindset, I think, is that, however you might term it, right? Fixed versus growth is fairly popular now. But that idea that there's more than enough to go around instead of a zero-sum game where I only win a unit if you lose a unit, that is a lesson that was never well explained coming up, but people could model it. They just couldn't articulate it. And so I love that for our kids, that idea of abundance is a lot more common today. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The idea of gratitude felt like something that only happened on Sundays at church. Mm-hmm. And today I hear people talk about gratitude in all different walks of life. And I think, wow, what a beautiful thing.
Absolutely.
Just to recognize that it's not that things could be worse. It's that I enjoy a lot of good fortune.
Yeah. Right.
And when you hear people talking like that, I find that attractive.
Yep.
It's putting things into the universe and watching them come back. They do create the reality you want to live in.
Yeah.
So
that's good.
Yeah, I've been encouraged by that trend as I've seen that taking as well. And it does seem there's just more mindfulness when it comes to living and living in community with others and valuing the uniqueness that each person has to play in a thriving, vibrant community, and a lot of entrepreneurship that has been built around that as well, which is, it's pretty amazing time. I mean, like you said, like on one hand, like the entrepreneurship has never been more saturated, but it's also perhaps never been a more exciting time, just in terms of how hospitable the culture is towards receiving new entrepreneurs that have ideas or businesses that they're designing for the common good of people around them.
Yeah, I mentioned that I was a business undergrad, and I remember when they started an entrepreneurship program at Boise State, my alma mater, and having grown up in that environment and seeing the hardship of small Main Street businesses, I thought, what in the heck are they even going to talk about? Right? You have a professor who's predominantly always been in school and then goes straight into teaching. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what they're drawing on. Mm-hmm. And the professors that initially were teaching it were academically interested. But so many of the lessons tend to be about business structure and the create a product, position a product, right? But so much of what we're talking about in terms of entrepreneurship is the same things that I think as a parent I want my kids to pick up on, which is there's a giving instead of just receiving. Yeah. You know, and there's a listening that is critical to learning.
Yeah.
The abundance mindset, you know, all of those things. You could give the same kid $1 million and it'd be gone in a handful of years. But you could teach them these things, and there's not a dollar value on them, but it's all of the skills to make whatever they would choose. Yeah. So
it's been great.
I love it.
What question did I not answer with the answer you wanted?
No, there wasn't any. What I'll do is I'll just transition us to our last gold nugget round.
All right.
How's that sound?
Golden nuggets.
Bring on the golden nuggets.
Well, this is
perfect, right around dinner time.
That's right.
Nugget time.
Golden nugget.
Well, this has been absolutely awesome. Toby, it's been wonderful having you on. As always, I find myself getting lost in time as we just continue to dialogue through just creative ideas and bouncing the skills and lessons learned. But we're going to start wrapping this thing up. So we're going to transition to our gold nugget round, which we always do with our guests. So we got 4 questions we're going to ask you. We're going to fire them your way. So the first one here is pick one of these categories in life that you're working on growing this year. So we got family, finance, faith, fitness, and future. Tell us something you're focused on and excited about here in 2024.
Yeah. I love your gold round questions, guys. This is fun. For me, it's been about fitness, the world of work, and in the middle of a startup. You know, it's really easy to discover that you haven't put 2 feet in front of one another all day long. And working from home means that I can go all day with 500 steps back and forth to the bathroom and the coffee pot, and so. When I think about that, it's, all of those are attributes of wealth. Yeah. And so I have a beautiful family that I love, and I have a comfortable life. But what dawns on me, especially as I watch my parents in their later 70s, it's that the investments I make now in my health and the habits I develop, my kids are going to be picking up on. Yep. It's going to improve their life, but I'm also going to be around for more of their life. Mm-hmm. And so when my youngest didn't show up until I was almost 40, the stork didn't find her address, I guess. But all of a sudden I thought, oh my God, what if she doesn't get married and have kids until she's 40? I'm going to have to be 80 years old to hold that grandbaby? Dementia aside, the physical task, I got to be here to be present. So fitness that's a really long answer. Fitness in 24 is my thing.
No, that's great. That's a great one. And I think, we continue to come back to, they're all just so intricately tied together. And
it's
you
so
hit
true.
it. I mean, you just even hit the 2, the family piece, the fitness piece. That's good.
It's the energy piece of
it's the energy.
Yeah.
Well, and the other element that I almost said was the faith, and it's talking about the gratitude. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so oftentimes we're hung up on the things we didn't attain. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But everybody else is like, my gosh, look at all these other things. You must be really proud of those.
Yeah.
No. Those are already done. That was yesterday.
That's right.
So,
yeah. No. But
I'm going to have to go fitness.
You have to press in there too. I love it. Well, you've given us a couple of these here, but let's get another one if it comes to mind. What's a quote from a book or mentor that stuck with you along your journey?
Let me think for a second. You can carve out this really long pause so I sound smarter. Probably one of my favorites is I believe it's a Chinese proverb, right? The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
The second best is today.
Yeah.
And so as I think about, your global listening audience, the challenge that so many people have is that who am I in this corner of the world to have such big aspirations? Right. The answer is, you're as entitled as anybody else. And so that idea of, yes, we all wish we would have bought more property 20 years ago. We all wish somebody would have planted the tree 20 years ago. But the next best time is absolutely today. So back to the point of indecision, all you're doing with indecision is pushing hard decisions down the road and foregoing the necessary curing time. Every venue is a matter of get in there, be working at it for a while, and then you just slowly accumulate. So we need more trees, right?
Love that.
That's
solid. No, that's a good one.
Good.
Next one here. What's a dream or goal that you have that you've not been able to make happen yet?
So interestingly, it has nothing to do with the world of entrepreneurship, but I do still intend between now and the rocking chair and iced tea every afternoon, or cocktails as it might be on the beach. But I started teaching as an adjunct professor just a couple of years ago, and my course is all on demand, and so all I ever hear is when people have problems, right? But I've been a guest lecturer for different friends at the university level, and I love it. And it goes back to this idea of wanting to share.
Yep.
Yeah. And so having the opportunity to teach as adjunct means that I get to revisit the material and be that professor that I always wanted, which was you have the firm academic basis. It's grounded, it's citable, people have proven it out, but it needs to be seasoned with real world experience. And so early on, I thought, what a marvelous career, to be an educator and cultivating and encouraging people in their learning journey. And I didn't feel like I'd earned the bona fides I wanted from a professor. And so only now at this stage of my career do I feel like I can speak with both authority and the humility in a way that makes it accessible to others. In my 30s, I could have talked with all kinds of authority because I would have been talking out my hat, right? I would have been so confident about all the things that I only understood maybe an inch deep. Now that I know so many things at an inch and a half level, there's a new level of humility at it. So
you got all kinds of things to teach now.
I got all kinds of, 1,000 ways not to do.
That's right.
So many things.
That's good. Well, last one here. At the end of your life, what do you hope you'll be remembered for?
You'd think you didn't give me these questions in advance, huh? At the end of my life, you know what? I think it's mostly that the time spent together was well spent. And we often think about that with regards to family and friends.
Yeah.
But we spend an enormous amount of time, waking hours as adults with our colleagues,
right,
with our customers, And so too often we forget that when people come to us in a professional context, we are performing, right? We're performing a service, we're performing a task, but we are performing. And being a performer and showing up effectively and giving them a memorable experience, if that's not job one, I don't know what is. And so I would hope that at the end of my life, people would say, you know what, I was glad to have had some time with him. I wish he knew how to juggle, but aside from that, he was a pretty good guy.
That's good.
I love I mean, so much of what we've discussed here has just been gold. But those last two responses in particular, I think, really encapsulate a lot of who you are and the unique value that you bring, and why so much of the reason why we wanted to have you on is because it's not merely about the success or the number of accolades that you can put up on a wall or the number of zeros in a bank account. All of those things are nice. None of those are bad or wrong, but that there's a further impetus to want to give, to want to share what it is that you've learned, certainly through the teaching that you're doing now, but even greater aspirations to do that further. And then, just that whole spirit that you captured of leaving the people and places that you've been in better than you found them. And I think that's so much of what good entrepreneurship ought to be. And so really grateful for everything that you've shared, for taking the time to sit down with us. If people,
thanks for having me.
Oh yeah.
This has been, I still don't know why, but I appreciate you guys inviting me on the show.
I feel like I've said this genuinely on the last few episodes, but I mean, we will need to do a follow-up because you've alluded to the startup, but we didn't get into it.
It's very stealthy.
Yes, it's totally in stealth mode right now. But as soon as you're ready to unveil it all, the Abundant Journey podcast will be the place to do it.
That's right.
Please, we want to have exclusive access. But seriously, I mean, there's still so much more that we could have talked about. In the meantime, anywhere that people should try and connect with you? You active on LinkedIn or any platforms like that? Or if they wanted to get in touch, where would you send them?
I have all of the footprints.
Cool.
Right? You're not going to find me on TikTok.
No, you're not doing the
I do most of my
dances or
dancing. It has a higher cost threshold. Okay. So I'm also not on OnlyFans, if that's what you might be thinking.
You'd be the first link that we'd have on there.
Maybe I need to set up an account. Maybe that's what I'm missing.
So we'll let you know what kind of demand we get through the through our
let's gauge the feedback. That'll be our test, our hypothesis here. The best way, I think, is LinkedIn, and I'll tell you why. And it's that I view LinkedIn as a way for me to share all the incredible people that I know. And traditionally, and I would still say probably 70% of my contacts are people I have some kind of relationship with.
Yep.
I've been inundated, like all of us, with random spammers.
Yep.
But what I love about LinkedIn is that if you're trying to make a connection, or if you're trying to learn, and I think that's really who we're talking to, right, is people that are hungry to learn. There's no better way than to reach out and say, hey, Toby, how do I get in touch with Nick? Or, hey, Nick, how do I get in touch with, I don't want to talk to Toby, but I want to talk to that other guy.
Yep.
So LinkedIn is powerful that way. That's where I'd invite people to join me.
Right on. Well, we'll include a link in the show notes to your profile there.
That sounds great.
Yeah. In the meantime, listeners, also be sure to check out abundantjourney.net. There's a link at the top of the page that'll take you to our newsletter, which we'll be going big on that this year as well. Anything else that you got for us, Mr. Nick James?
No, we got more episodes lined up. We're going to keep them coming. We always enjoy these conversations. I think maybe I would add, listeners, you get the flavor of what we're doing and who we're talking to. So if anybody else comes to mind that is in your circle and you say, hey, this person needs to be on the show to share their story and their wisdom, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear from them. So be sure to include that and send us an email from the website.
100%.
I love it, guys.